Thank you very much for your effort here just in this last couple hours, as well as the whole weekend. But I'm going around just listening to the level of the conversations happening in each one of the groups was great. And I look forward to the reports or what they've come out and with suggestions as we hear in another hour. But the first thing we're going to do is have a thought and an explanation of the XCPI from EquiRatings. Everybody knows Dearman and Sam by now, I think, brothers in arms. So if you guys can, we'll welcome EquiRatings and what they've done to our sport. We want to thank them. And we look for this, what are we, EquiRatings 2.0 or 3.0, 4.0, so 2.0, okay. Okay, there you go.
Great, thank you, David. Firstly, thank you all for your support over the last couple of days, for all the questions, for all the times we're challenged. You know, at Tattersalls, it felt like a real turning point of all of us being together, and I think that's continued since. When you look even at the presentation so far, actually it was just a breakout group last year when we discussed the use of video, and then when we looked at David's presentation today, it really started making things come to light, you know, in terms of engaging and actually how we can begin to answer questions. It was a very different to the original presentations that we had last year. A breakout group, then, you know, putting in place a plan, that plan being implemented. I think it's a huge credit to everyone in the room, and in particular people on all the various teams inside the FEI, Natalie from a data point of view, and Fred, Tim, who's helping with the data internally and keeping everybody accountable on that, and to all the external people who are creating the data at source, whether that's video or whether that's in the form of results. It has felt very different this year again, and it's a huge progress. So well done to everybody on that one. The purpose of today, and I mean, we've looked at this presentation 3 or 4 different times, even in the last day, as to how we would get through it all and what would be the best thing to present. So we're trying to keep it absolutely exclusively to this concept of a cross-country performance indicator. It is or has been IRCI when we originally began, and one of the challenges that we've had with that, or one of the challenges that was laid down to us by the FEI about a year ago, was that we get it, we understand why it happens, but in order for us to have a more, to implement, we're going to need to make this very transparent and very understandable, because it's totally fine for you two nerds to stand up here and present something, but actually we need to be able to have this conversation at a coffee break or at the side of an arena. So we need this to be more simple, more transparent, and to have the evidence to show that it is going to have an effect. So that's been our challenge this year, and this is the version of what we've come up with. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what it is, why we use it, and how we use it. I'll start with this very famous one at all of these conferences. I think it's now fully attributable to Dr. Rob Stevenson, who, despite it being there in advance, we now just know it as Rob Stevenson's theory around Swiss cheese, or cheesecake, which I really liked from Laurent, and I think that may be something that we use in future, whether we call it Swiss cheese or cheesecake, the concept remains the same. And what we want to talk about is adding another layer into that concept of cheesecake. What we have at the moment, and we've talked about this weekend, is these athlete categories. And what are they measuring? They're measuring athlete experience. That is what those categories do. And we'll be able to show you that actually they're working very well at the top of the sport. We are seeing that the A category riders have a lower horse fall rate than the others, and Bs are pretty close to it. And we've normalized that then per level. So we know that A category riders compete more at higher levels, where we are likely to have lower cross-country jumping clear rates or higher fall rates. So when you normalize it per levels, you do actually begin to see that for those top couple of groups, the athlete category is serving a purpose. Athlete experience is what we're measuring with an athlete category. Then we have MEORs, and at the moment MEORs are our way of measuring horse experience. We're making sure that a certain level of competency has been hit at least once. What we're proposing that we try to begin to add to this cheesecake is horse performance, and also a concept that we've talked about for some time, and how we find a way of actually delivering that is increasing rider responsibility. It's something that we've talked about for years, but how are we going to actually make that happen? What tool can we use that allows us to increase rider responsibility rather than simply wanting it? Would you like to come in, XCPI?
Yeah, exactly. So what it is then is it's a current measure of your performance. It's a summary of all your results. So we know with the MER saying, have you achieved a level of performance at this level? And then we'll talk through an example where that could have been achieved 6 months ago, it could have been achieved a year ago. How are you currently performing now? And rather than asking just one question, we're asking for a sample of results to get the full picture. Because I think that's what we started with as a gut feeling, and then was backed up a little bit with the ERKI, was that when we look at people's past results, it doesn't quite look like they should be at this competition. I think that's what people are really getting to when they say that the equity ratings numbers is making sense. We get a lot of false praise in that it does not tell us who is going to fall. That's the incorrect use of it. When we use it in a case of saying that, well, equity ratings told us that was going to happen, where yes, we do measure risk, yes, we can show that there is a slight level, there is an increase of risk, but it's back to risk management. And what it is, it's a summary and it's a measurement of how that horse is currently performing. And that's as simple as we want to go. How it works is we have outcomes. We've simplified it down to 3 outcomes. Did they jump clear? Did they have a single fault? Or was it something else? Was it a fall? Was it a multiple jumping faults? Okay, so there's 3 things. A clear, which is always going to be a positive. A single fault, if you're at 5-star and you have 20 penalties, that might still increase your current form rating for a lower level, because you've still managed to go around a 5-star. And again, it's data driven as to how we're measuring these outcomes, but these are the outcomes we're looking for. What's really important is that there is a neutral outcome. This is important when we start getting into decision making and rider responsibility. It's also important with data quality, is that if somebody is on course, they feel that today's not the day, the horse isn't going, and they've jumped everything clear so far, but they decide to put their hand up and retire, that they're not getting penalized. We don't have enough information to say that we can put the rating up, but we are also not going to put the rating down. So there's a neutral outcome as well. How I want to show it in play, this difference. This is a real example taken from the database, and it also talks a little bit as to why we came about with this rating. Horse A and Horse B, 2 horses competing, both with the intention of going to a 4-star short, and both already with 1 4-star short MER. The reason I chose an example of that is because sometimes we think, oh, well, I went clear around a 4-star short once, so I'm definitely ready. He's a 4-star short horse for sure, and we're trying to show that this can look different. Okay, so Horse A on the left, we're going to start going through their form. They compete in a 3-star long. They actually already have the 4-star short qualification at this point. They drop down to a 3-star long and they have 40 penalties. And you'll see -4 is the value that gets attributed to that. We'll go into where those values come from. They will be transparent. They will be in a rule book. You will be able to create your own rating and calculate your own rating. But that's what it looks like. On the right, Horse B was in a 2-star long, so a level down. They went clear, and it's +1 point. It's only +1 point because we're talking about a horse who's trying to go to a 4-star short. I don't want to get into too much detail, but I'm going to run through an example so that people get a feel for it. This is where these outcomes are coming from. You can see the horse that we just talked about was clear in a 2-star long, and that's where the 1 point came from. The other horse, Horse A, was in a 3-star long and had the other outcome, which is where the -4 comes from. So you can see, had one of those horses competed in a 5-star long and gone clear, their rating for a 4-star short would have gone up by 7.5 points. And that's where these values come from. Keep going. So as we go through, and we can go through them quite quickly, horse A in a 3-star short goes clear. We're now saying +2. Horse B over here was clear in a 3-star short, also up +2. 20 penalties for horse A in a 3-star short, -2.5. Clear again for horse B, +3.5 in a 3-star long. What's kind of deciding these values is the level at which the outcomes are taking place. You can see the difference between whether it's a 3-star long or a 2-star short. The level at which we're going to, so are we trying to qualify for a 5-star or are we trying to qualify for a 3-star long? That is relevant as well. The type of the outcome, and we're taking into account all outcomes. This is really the USP of the rating, is that we're not just going to say, what have you done well? We're looking at the balance between how many good outcomes are you having and how many negative outcomes you're having. A couple of problems is not a problem. We all have, us mortals make mistakes. William Fox Pitt is in the room. There are some that don't make too many mistakes. We will make mistakes, and the aim is that we learn from them. It's when we see examples of people making lots and lots and lots of mistakes and still trying to go to the next level. As soon as they get the 1 MER, it's like, okay, I'm now ready for the next level. And that's the thing we're trying to impact here. So again, horse A is now on to 40 penalties in a 4-star short. This is they're now attempting that 4-star short level. They've had 40 penalties, it's a -3. Horse B is still at the lower level, still at 3-star level. They're building up their rating. They've gone into another 3-star long and they've gone clear, so they're at +3.5. Horse A again has now tried a 3-star long, and this is a real record and a real sequence of events. So these are the types of records that we see when we're like, God, they're having a lot of problems. This is the horse A situation. So 40 penalties in a 3-star long, another -4. Horse B, meanwhile, still jumping clear consistently in a 3-star short. And what this starts to touch on is something that came up yesterday when we talked about qualifications. We don't want to blanket increase qualifications for everyone necessarily. If a horse and rider are going through the levels without problems, they don't necessarily have to keep doing more and more qualifications necessarily. This is where we balance the MER requirements, which will stay there, but rather than having to increase them too much for everyone, we might have to increase them in places for certain athletes, but it's another layer that we're also saying, if you are sailing through and you're not having problems, or you're having occasional problems but not repetitive problems, then we don't need to increase your qualifications. But if you're having repetitive problems, we may have to increase, or we have a tool for it. So again, we're just back to the table of where these numbers are coming from, and we're getting to the end where we now have, in their last 6 results, horse A has now had a 40, a clear, a 20, a 40, a 40, a 20, at the different levels. You can see on the left, the 3-star long, the 3-star short, and the values that they're getting. Now clear in a 3-star long, and actually for horse A, clear in their last 2 runs, but the XCPI value is still negative. The value that really matters is the -1.06, because it's the average of your outcomes, and that's really what when we're displaying an XCPI, it will be that value, it will be the average. But people can look up their values and they can calculate their average, whereas the horse B on the right is +22, which is an average of 2.75. On paper, these horses both have, at this point in time, they both have 1 MER at a 4-star long. So from that point of view, they look similar. But from a form point of view, they look very different. And so that's what our rating is based upon, and how we calculate it. Reiterating the points of what matters, what outcome took place, what level did it take place at, what level are you trying to go to, looking at the positives and the negatives. And the only other thing I will say is that for 2- and 3-star level, we don't look back on quite as big a sample of results. We look back at 6 runs, whereas at 4- and 5-star level, we look back at 8 runs. Again, when we were building it, that's what it was telling us when we were building different ways of calculating it. It tells us when the information is relevant. At the lower levels, the information is not so relevant when you go back 7 or 8 runs, whereas it is when you're at the higher levels. This is an example of the athlete categories and how we assess whether athlete categories are giving us useful information. Dirham talked about normalizing it. So A riders don't do so many 2-star internationals. They do quite a lot of 4 and 5-star internationals, so they naturally are exposing themselves to higher levels of risk. So every time they compete, we analyze them against the average horse fall rate for that level. And we can see that A riders are coming out about 0.6% below the average horse fall rate. So they are, and you can see the confidence around that, they are well below the 0 line, which would be the average. So we know for sure that A athletes are having lower horse fall rates. And the same for B athletes. It's not quite so much of a jump down, it's at minus 0.4%. But it gives you a feel. The reason we bring it up is A, to let us know that athlete categories are working, but B, to know what a gain looks like, what a layer of Swiss cheese or a mouthful of cheesecake looks like, is these kind of small 0.4, 0.2% gains on the horse fall rate, because it's a rare outcome. Thankfully, we're not dealing with something that happens very frequently. If we just go back 1D, we can see that the C, D, and NC riders, non-categorized riders, there's not so much of a difference between them, which is then gives us an area of where we need to look at. So maybe where we, again, it depends when you can hone in on certain levels, but again, it's information as to where we're getting a good indication and then where we're not getting such a clear differentiation. This is the XCPI, and we break it down into, we put those negative XCPI values, like you saw for horse A in the example, would go into the E bucket. And then we've got a D. We go up for every layer. So a horse that's averaging between 0 and 1 would be in D, between 1 and 2 would be in C, and so on as you go up by layer. And you can see that as those XCPI categories improve for the horses, we know that our A++, A+, and A horses are all below the normalized horse fall rate. Our samples get a lot smaller. So our E category is actually only 3% of the population, so it's a really small number. If we were to make this kind of more significant, we could go for a bigger impact, try and impact a bigger proportion of the population, but that becomes a strategical decision as to how many people do we want to try and impact. But it shows us that relationship is the XCPI telling us something with regards to horse falls. And that's where we also entertain the idea of, and we'll look at the idea of having an audit of this number, that there's a third party comes in and goes, well, Equity Ratings can be the guys that build it. We can look internally within the FEI, or even we can look to someone else to audit this number and see where's best to implement it. But this is what it's showing us, that it is that as the category increases. We talk about cost benefit of a number when it comes to a tool. What is our cost is usually that we have to redirect starters to a different level. If we're going to implement this number, that we're going to be saying to a couple of people potentially, you're not going to line up at this 5-star long, you need to line up at another 4-star short or another 4-star long. That's the cost. And we look at who we are impacting and how many people we're impacting, and what that is saving us. What are we gaining from that? And our E category here, across all levels, would be 3% of starters. If you look at their clear cross-country jumping rate, I include this as part of the cost. If we start impacting the people who are winning at the sport, that's quite a high cost, because you're talking about changing people who are like, hang on, my horse was going to go up in value, I was going to sell it, or I was going to go to Olympic Games and win, and you're telling me. So we're looking at who we're impacting as well. The people that we're impacting are going clear less than 50% of the time, when the average is up at 70%, and you see that those A categories are up there around the mid 80%. So again, we're impacting people who have a very low performance rate as well, and I think that's an important part of the conversation. Rider fall rate, we can see where it is there. We can see the numbers on the horse falls. We're talking about 650 starters impacted and 11 horse falls saved. So we are not that is 639 people that didn't have a horse fall, and it's only slightly above the average. And it's actually in that amber area, that 1.9%, where you see the highest level of risk. But the question becomes, can we start to implement people? We see the same in show jumping. that at 4 rails down, there's a spike in a relationship between the likelihood of having a horse fall, but it then drops away a little bit at 20 and 24 faults. But the question is, if we implement at 24 faults, can we start to affect the psychology at 4 down and start to improve it that way indirectly? We'll skip on through here.
So this is kind of one of the implementation pieces in terms of what does this mean, or how will I ever see it? So you can't see the names of the horses or the athletes here, but what we've tried to do is a couple of things. One of the things which the team at the FEI felt was helpful is, rather than simply providing a number without all of the communication which is required to actually make that decipherable in some way, to include, when you're having a conversation as a group, something as simple as percentage of clears in the last 10 runs. Simply so that when standing in a group, you're able to give it some level of conversation to be able to say, okay, well, actually, there's a horse there who's only been clear 4 in his last 10 runs. That is maybe something that we're going to have a chat about. And then you've got this XCPI number on the right-hand side. So this is a printed document which has been circulated with the ERKI number on it across 2019 to certain officials. And this is the process that we are proposing for 2020 to the FEI, that this would be a document that people see certainly behind the scenes at the outset. And this brings us to the why use it, because you can see it's quite a small amount of people impacted. We constantly have to challenge ourselves into what kind of difference do we expect this could have or has the potential to have. Some of them are a little bit intangible, but I think what we can see is that using a small sample of results can be a lot better at helping us get a picture of where a horse is performing, rather than a single result, a snapshot, a picture. Almost like that video and picture technology, or there's lots of accountancy analogies around it as to why, rather than a single point in time, your MER, the first question you would ask if you were buying horse A or horse B is not, are they 4-star qualified, but actually, how's this horse actually performing? So this is the concept of the sample being more effective when you're assessing performance. This is what we actually talk about when we're in conversations. The second point, and again one that we've all talked about for a long time, is that horse form goes up and down. Of course, it is possible to get an MER and to continue that rise alongside your experience of constantly getting better. And there may be one single little blip along the way, or a couple of little blips along the way. And this tool and our messaging, which is going to be critical as a group, not just as equi-ratings, is absolutely never trying to say that we don't want our horses to make mistakes. We all accept that there's a huge amount of learning that happens within a horse making a mistake and a rider making a mistake, a huge amount of learning. So it is not trying to say we don't want mistakes. It is trying to impact that very small group that we also talk about, which is horse B. When we get to a point where we're actually at 1 clear from the last 7 runs, I think it's a slightly different conversation than a horse learning from a mistake. That's the point at which we want to know, well, why are these mistakes happening all of the time?
I love this about decision making. Someone asked me to explain rider responsibility once. They were a rider. It sprung to mind actually this morning when I was out there on the course, and Andrew Tulloch was saying, we were at Beechers and there was a couple of falls and they put the screens up and everyone assumed the worst. And actually, it was just 2 jockeys. And I thought, God, that's how it's, that is the reality of where we are. If you put yourself in danger as a rider, you're accountable to yourself. But if you put your horse in danger, and I think that's what was being referred to, was that the worst is that there's a horse down there, that from a public point of view. Then, if you put your horse in danger, and this is back to rider responsibility, you're not just accountable to yourself, you're accountable to a much wider audience. And if you put the sport in danger, again, you're not just accountable to yourself, you're accountable to a wider audience. So trying to make better decisions from a rider point of view, it's not about saying, well, I want to go to this event and I need to be qualified, here and here. So I need to run him at this event next weekend. He's maybe not quite ready, but I take a chance. Otherwise, I'm not going to get to that event. And it's about actually trying to change that thought process, going, well, what is the horse actually ready for at this point in time? We're talking about really 3% here. Like we're talking about outliers, really. It's not that everyone is thinking this way. Most people do campaign their horse until they're ready to step up, and they do listen to what their horse is telling them. But this is about saying that if you go out tomorrow and you compete and it doesn't go well, and you already have an inclination that is probably the most likely thing that's going to happen, is that you will go out and have 20 penalties, it's not helping your cause. Your rating now goes down. It's not going to help your chances of competing in future. It's actually going to hinder them. So that now you're thinking about, okay, maybe I cross-country school the horse a little bit more, maybe I will ring up a trainer and get a little bit of help.
Can we give people a reason, essentially, to try and make a better decision? Because at the moment, that decision isn't costing people anything. At the moment, the horse is a little bit green. It's a conversation we've heard lots of times, but I feel like I can probably go. We talked about it ourselves, or riders that I was having lunch with talked about it, where, well, there's like another space in the lorry. We might as well just see if he's ready. And it happens all across the sport, and it's okay, but there's never been a negative consequence for that. And again, we're talking about a very small group of people. But when we bear in mind yesterday's conversation around pictures and around, probably 80-90% of what we discuss as a group on weekends like this, and a huge amount of work way beyond weekends like this, we're talking about managing a very small group of people who are making a decision that we can potentially help. So that's the kind of the pre-competition.
And the other one, because it was quite topical, is about in competition. If your horse is feeling like it's not a going day and you have tried to reverse that for a few fences and change the psychology of the horse that it can become a going day, and you still feel like you're in a losing battle, you're not going to get penalized for pulling up. It's not a case of, but if I retire, the rating's going to go down. That's not going to happen. So we're trying to make this very practical as well in terms of implementation.
This is the final slide. It goes back to the concept. Can we add in another layer of protection for the horses, for the riders, and for the sport? One of the intangible pieces has been the psychology piece and the rider responsibility piece. Have we got any tool in our armory at the moment that allows us to be able to ask the riders to make better decisions? And the rider responsibility piece probably remains one of the really interesting areas of psychology. What we've seen is that it's not always going to be a case that the rule or the stick approach is going to be effective in changing behavior. Actually, what people tend to chase down when we talk about MEORs, we all hear it. Well, I've got my MEOR. I've heard it coming off the course. Yes, 5-star qualified. Or athlete categories. I want to be an A rider, or I want to be a B rider. But both of those things are about pushing up. They're about achievement. They're not necessarily to do with the bottom end and, well, I don't want to be something. It's not that I don't want to be a C rider. I want to be an A rider. So rather than constantly having to communicate risk as a negative thing, when we talk about performance, let's try to give ourselves a framework and a tool which allows us to talk about performance and risk as a positive thing. So if we talk about trying to improve your XCPI, actually we're hoping that we can drag up that bottom group by trying to improve their horse's XCPI. How we communicate that. Have we got leagues? Have we got articles written about actually there's brilliant XCPI performers in the sport? Let's talk about some of the amazing XCPI horses that are competing at 105 level at the moment, or competing at 2-star long in Southwest Europe region. And we give ourselves tools to be able to actually promote really positive cross-country riding And rather than worrying about the end, which we're doing kind of as an unintended consequence now, they begin to aspire to be better. They want a better XCPI, so they enter potentially, hopefully, fingers crossed, at a level that can improve their XCPI rather than the current situation of potentially feeling that there's a space left in the lorry. And I know he's not really ready, but he is qualified, and let's just see what happens. It's actually not really going to have a negative impact on my decision after that. I'll still go to badminton. And that's it. So what we're trying to do, we have a tool in our armory right now, which is showing us some good results around athlete categories and athlete experience. We have a tool in our armory which is giving us a snapshot of horse experience, which is MER. What we're hoping to include in this cheesecake is, can we have a tool for horse performance, giving us this little bit of a sample? And again, can we have a tool rather than just a constant conversation that allows us to hopefully push towards actually rider responsibility? Thank you.
Questions?
Any questions? How we're using this tool right now, is if we give this information to the ground jury members at an event, and it's whether we just take out the next step. And I think this version seems to be something that's way more user-friendly, I would say, to riders and for people to understand. So I think that it's a direction that we go, because we were talking a little bit at lunch and about the example is that if I run a marathon and I don't finish, I actually don't stop. My not finishing for whatever reason is not going to take the top marathoner from running their sport. Whereas this bottom group, 3%, 5%, whatever the number is, actually can have an impact on the sport as a whole. And so looking at this 3% for whatever the number is, and their performances and how that affects the sport, it's a huge question, and that's what I think these guys have been wrapping their heads around, and what we're all trying to wrap our heads around is that aspect. What effect does it, as you say, what effect does it have on the sport, or the risk that it has on the sport as a whole? Mike, and then Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great, guys. Well done. We talked in the past about grading courses as to whether, did you ever find a mechanism of grading courses, or is that something you've just moved on from altogether?
It is something that we've looked at, and again, it becomes a question of, you start off with things like the clear rates, and very quickly you run into, well, actually, what level of horses were turning up there before we begin to say whether the clear rate was high or low, and also giving ourselves a big enough sample to be not just simply 1 year where it may be wet, or 1 year where it may be very dry, or 1 year where there may be a particular fence. So it's something that we've had to proceed with caution, again, so that we don't ever release or try to give anybody the wrong information. But we are looking constantly at various courses. Want to take anything on that?
It depends what question you're looking for, Mike. In terms of, did that course cause significantly more falls? That's harder to do because they're less frequent, and most competitions typically around 30 to 40 starters, so it's quite hard to test that course. Bigger courses, yes, you can test. This is much more the figures for this on horse falls. Like the level of predictability is not quite as high as, say, for rider falls. So we have stayed away from rider falls, but the predictability is a lot higher for rider falls, and it's very good for clear rounds. So if you're saying, was this course particularly easy in terms of cross-country clears, we can give you a much better question, and also because clear rounds are far more frequent. So we get a much better idea. Depends what question you want to ask when you're grading events. Was it significantly easy in terms of jumping? We can get quite a good feel on that quite early, so from small samples. But horse falls, you're going to need to look at much bigger, say over time, say a course over the last 5 years. Has there been a significantly high number of falls on this course?
Andrew?
Andrew fell from Ireland. I think it's a great product. I think it's a great idea. The question I have is, what do we need to do to be able to implement it sooner rather than later?
I think that's been something that we've discussed, and actually we spent a little bit of time in our last group discussing it. One of the challenges that we certainly, or one of the, I suppose, challenges laid down to us when we were working with the FEI last year was, in order to communicate this, we have got to make sure it's understandable. In order to ever set it as a rule, which is something which will have to be kind of down the line rather than advisory, and that's something that we have to discuss in terms of the second part of implementation, which we discussed in the last group, is ensuring that there is not just a transparency and something that we can communicate, but Tim mentioned the word accessible and independently accessible. We have to ensure that there's the confidence from you guys in a number that you're happy as a group and we are happy as a sport to stand behind when inevitably someone says, well, I don't agree with that. So I think in terms of the intangible benefits, we can begin to see it as an implementation tool, whether it becomes something that we, last year, officials began to have. What that does is it's definitely slower in terms of the intangible benefit around the actual rider responsibility and seeking out improved performance. The riders must know that number. We're happy giving them an athlete category and we're happy giving them an MER. So now the question is, are we happy giving them a horse performance metric? And I think that becomes, is it going to be accessible, and is it going to be transparent, and is it going to be easy to communicate? And I think we're there. Or certainly I see Tim.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways we're beta testing it really out in the field right now to see what the reaction is, and that's like we did with the Yorkie in one way. So we beta tested it, and it actually led to this. So right now we're kind of doing that preliminary testing of saying, okay, where is this gonna land? Is this the tool that everybody understands, everybody likes? It's useful to the officials, useful to the rider, useful to the owners, and so that's kind of where we are right now. So in that part, there's a tiny bit of time.
I think it could be very, very useful for the riders, especially for explaining to the owners. Because the amount of times you talk to a rider and you pick them up off the ground and they say, oh, I had to ride the bloody goddamn thing because I had to, because the owner was going to take the horse away from me and put him with another horse. And it will give, it needs to be something there so that the owner can turn around. The rider can say to the owner, right, I can go and take this horse around, and if it does have a problem, we're going to go right back down. And that gives them a much more clear tool. Because let's face it, every owner thinks their horse is the best in the world.
We'll take the 5-second delay off of the goddamn thing, right? We'll take that off of the, bleep it out. We'll do that.
Tim Parkin, University of Glasgow. So I'm going to ask similar questions to the one asked downstairs, but and the concept is great. I understand the concept and it's entirely the right thing to be doing. But what I'm interested in is the detail. So can you explain the sort of the validation process that you've gone through to prove that it does what it says on the tin? And again, I'll ask the question, what is the predictability of the new system?
So ROC values, which is probably what you would be interested in for the Urki, it was about 0.63, and then for this it drops a little to about 0.6. But again, it depends on which level we're looking at. So, but that is in terms of saying, is this a tool that can predict horse falls? That's how you would be assessing it, I think. Is this how we would measure it against is what other mechanisms do we have for under the banner of suitability to compete? In terms of answering the question, how do we have a tool out there to just monitor that there are no obvious people lining up at a competition that when we just intuitively look at a record, we go, that doesn't look right. And we have, again, thankfully, exceptions, but sometimes there are people with maybe 2 MERs at 4-star long over the last 3 years, but it's littered, even at 3-star short, littered with problems, and 4-star shorts. And there's a lot of the balance between positive and negative isn't there. So I know I'm drifting off your point there, Tim. But to get into that level of validation is something that we can show you, because I feel sorry for the FEI department sometimes, because the first time we sent them a report on this, it was about 35 pages long. And there's a lot of that, and that will have the ROC values at every level. It's something we're happy to work with you on. We tried to stay, if we just seek out horsefall predictability, we move away from something that intuitively gets accepted a little bit more, because we can go more complex like we did with the ERKI, but they won't understand how it was calculated. And you do have to be very hard on outcomes like horsefalls, very hard, because it will increase your ROC value. It will give you a much better number, but it makes it quite hard for you to then campaign that horse. So there is a balance. There's a lot of, and whether you want to get involved with that process, I mean, we'll be very open about everything. We'll show you all the different models we have and how they perform. And we definitely have to, and the message from us comes from, this does not tell you who is going to fall. Like those tables tell you, we're talking about marginal gains, but we're also talking about that situation whereby when you have the Adelaide situation, and for the Adelaide horsefall, there is someone who was on a perfect record and had a horsefall. They're not quite as likely, but it's not that different. Again, we're being as open as we can with the evidence. If I can give you any other answer to satisfy you, but I will certainly let you look at it and analyze it.
Guys, you've done another fantastic job, and it's a great product. My extension on this is how far away from a rider assessment, because this has got to do with the quality of the production of what you're doing as an individual with a combination. Can this be immediately extended, or could it be potentially extended to how you are as a physical rider? What's your capability to get you to that point? Is it possible?
Yeah, I think that there's about a quarter of horses that compete in a calendar year at FEI level. About a quarter of them will have less than 3 previous internationals on their record. So we're talking about a lot of horses within the FEI data having very small records. So we've got like our pending category, which is where we can't yet tell you anything, we can't rate you yet, is nearly 25%. There's a lot of people in that where we don't know any information about them. I would say that as a rider, unless I'm riding a lot of horses, at some point my outcomes will give me a really good indication as to how I'm performing. But not every 20 penalties is the same, not every, so I think that what you're talking about, Bruce, is a little bit in the coaching department. I love outcome-based training. I was talking yesterday about an exercise where I make people jump a rail 20 times at the height at which they want to compete, and see how many times they can actually clear that rail. And when they hit it from the knees, I'm saying, you want to go cross-country at this height, and you can't jump it 20 times in a row. That's outcome-based, and it's training, and you get much bigger samples, and you can quantify people's performance using that. So I think we have to be careful with exactly how much information we can gauge from the data we have here, but we can look at definitely using other types of data to answer that question.
So really, no more questions right now that I see, but we want to thank you guys. This is the next. We think this is the next step. I think also we talked a little bit about even at the 5-star level, where the 5-star level is, 5-star long, how like that, and even using this in one form or another, possibly for that level, to make that level the elite level for the people that should be there, because I think we would all agree at times we see people at 5-star levels that actually they really shouldn't be there. And going to track them and give them this horse performance indicator might be a level to step into that road. So, great. Thank you, guys. All right, now we're going to get into coaching and training. So William and John Holling from the United States, William from England, and Laurent from France are going to come up and just talk a little bit about the coaching training side, which we think is very, very important. and actually a big, huge piece of it. There's been pieces of this question that has been asked. Should we slow somebody down coming into the level for the first time? Who makes that decision? Are we trying to do it through governments? Are we trying to do it like the FEI or the national federations or local trainers or their parents? I mean, all of these things have been tapped on. So we really did want to get into talking a little bit about the training side of the question and what level that we should go with.
Okay, so we just thought we'd sort of go over our programs, how we would go about training our horses or our students. Be a little bit kind of a round table type discussion, if you will, and then we'll open it up to you guys for some back and forth. So sort of when we talked about it, you know, the one thing that we all decided on, and certainly I feel in my program, is that the cross-country training, it needs to be done in a systematic way. So the reality is you don't have to practice galloping across the field to big jumps too often. If you look at the problems that people have on cross-country, it's usually at the related combination. So it's going to be banks, ditches, water, things like that that cause the issue. So when I'm training my horses at my place in Florida, I've got a bank complex, I've got a coffin complex, I've got a couple water fences, and I'll set up questions that I feel are appropriate for those horses at that level and those riders. If I have a rider who wants to go out and do a 2-star, I'm going to set up questions that ask the difficulty of a 2-star, and they need to be able to answer those questions at home competently, consistently, before I feel they're ready to go out and do the job. Now, that doesn't always mean they have to jump to get ready for a 5-star. They don't have to jump 5-star height all the time, but they certainly need to be doing the difficulty. So for me, as you do that, you have to be, as a coach, as a competitor, as a trainer, realistic about your ability, your student's ability, and the horse's ability. Because not every rider or every horse is going to be naturally gifted enough to move up the levels, and you have to be realistic with yourself and with your students about that. I think the one thing that's great about eventers is we're tough and we feel like we are the hardest working people in equestrian sport, but that doesn't mean that if you work hard enough, long enough, that you're going to be able to do anything you want to do. It does come down to some natural ability as well. So again, like I said, I think you have to be comfortable, for me, with my students. If I know they're going to go jump around an advanced track on the weekend, they're going to have to show jump around an advanced track at home. I want them to be competent enough when they're competing that when they're at home, they master it, they own it, they can go do the job, so that when they go to the competition and they get nervous, the horse gets excited. If they can only muster 75% of their ability, I want them to be able to have a safe performance at the competition. And with that, I would say, you know, I've talked a lot with Lucinda Green over the years, and we would disagree on this, but in my program, I feel you 100% have to be able to canter down to a fence and see your distance and know where you are all the time. That doesn't mean you have to dictate the stride. It just means that when it's coming up, when you're approaching the fence, you need to be able to make some adjustments. You need to be able to be smooth about it. And sort of the general rule of thumb with my students is, if you're riding up to a fence and I can see you making the adjustments, then you're not good enough to be riding at the level. It needs to be smooth. It needs to be done well. It needs to look, honestly, a good cross-country track, to me, it looks like it's smooth and he's not doing anything. So you guys take it from there.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, obviously, we're talking about training and developing our sport horses from quite a personal point of view. And I know we're in a room full of experts, and there's going to be a million ways of skinning the cat. So please do chip in as we go, because we might say something that is a bit off the wall. But this is very much our way. I'm a bit older than him, a bit more set in my ways. And I think that you do, in our sport, very much have to have your system that you believe in, a system that you've really thought about, that is going to produce you as a rider. But the basic thing is you want to train your horse to be safe. You want to train him to be clever. You want to train him to be a good horse, and it's your job to do that. There's lots of textbooks, lots of experts that can teach you about bending lines and seeing strides and stuff like that. But in the real world, things do go wrong. We do find a bad stride, I'm afraid. We do find a bad line. Things do go wrong, and we need our horses to really help us out. And I feel that the modern world is becoming so perfect and so exact and so demanding. Everyone is trying to ride like Michael Young, and that's not the real world. So very much we've got to train our horses, I believe, to be quick on their feet, to be clever. You know, we talk about distances from the base of a fence. I think Giuseppe spoke very correctly about it's the sharpness of our horses, and it is our job to really train that into them from a young age. I love training my young horses, but I've also inherited some older chaps and had to kind of get them on my wavelength and adjust to how they are. So very much it comes in two ways, but I think we're talking very much in general about training young horses, training young riders to really adjust and to be reactive. I think in the modern world, everyone is so, certainly in England, so wanting to get out there and compete. I remember years ago I was on a training course with Martin Plaver, and he said, the problem with you Brits, and he said it very nicely, you're all autodidacts. And I thought, what on earth is an autodidact? So I had to look it up in the dictionary. And I think us Brits are, lots of people aren't, Americans particularly, they want to learn everything. There are Americans that only want to go to clinics. They don't want to go to a competition, they just want to be pretty and good and accurate and have fun doing that. I wouldn't say there's probably a single Brit that does that. We want to get out there, compete, even if it's not very pretty. We want to go and do it. But now in this modern day, we've got to be safe, and we are responsible for our own safety. And yes, we all need trainers, and trainers are having more and more of a role, more and more of a presence. But again, if you go to an event in America, there wouldn't be a rider there without a trainer. Whereas if you...
No, you have trainers with trainers.
Whereas you went to 100 down the road, you probably only find 5 people there with their trainer, and the rest are just kind of kamikazing around and having a jolly good go and having a good old blast, and just hopefully you don't watch them go cross country, because it's exciting. But as a result, the Americans, the Americans do therefore learn. And we are adapting that, and I think we're becoming very aware, and we are wanting trainers to be, even we're saying earlier on about, nearly a trainer signing us off to let us go up a level. I have a very set system. I'm very stuck in my ways, and I've done the same thing for 25 years, and I'm not changing. But, I know how many events I do, at what level, with what horse, and I don't break those rules, whereas I know people do. They get a bit excited, or they really need to be ready to go to Chatsworth. It's the last event in the world that they should be going to, but off they go. And no one tells them not to, because, that would be a bit depressing. But I think we do need now people who are advising us, whether it's trainers at the event maybe a little bit more often. We don't want people to run our lives, but we do just need to be aware that in the sport, younger riders need more help. There is more, in our day when we all started, no one had a trainer. You just got on and you went, and it was survival of the fittest, and hopefully you got there. Whereas the day has moved on from that, and I think the sport is really moving with that. But going back to kind of ways of training, I really want, my horses to be quick, to think on their feet, and I think that we so quickly focus on skinny roll tops and corners and related distances and angles and all precise stuff. We actually forget to jump plenty of banks, plenty of ditches, funny terrain, teaching our horses what cross country is. We're very guilty again in this country that some of our best training grounds are on all weather. I mean, is that cross country? I know I always say that is going to be, sadly, our sport of the future, but it's not there yet. And the first bit of mud we meet is going round Morton in 2nd of March, and we all have a pretty scary ride. But that's not surprising, is it? So we've got to use our brains to training our horses on terrain, different fences. I'm, again, very boring for all of you, but I'm a big believer in teaching your horse to jump slowly, because horses learn better slowly. Have to remember how small a horse's brain is. And when they're going slowly, they digest things, they react, and they can therefore move on. We're all very quick about, yeah, he's lovely, he's fancy, he can jump a big jump, and we're going to go and win a novice. And it's possible that some horses never even been quick in their life, and the first time they go quick is round Twinkle Down Novice. And it's, again, is that safe? Is that sensible? So as well as not producing the best horse, you're also carried away in our sport now about this this result, and getting carried away with speed. You bang a big bit in and you've got a horse that's hardly knowing what he's doing, and then suddenly you think pressure from owner, sponsors, you're suddenly going to an intermediate, sometimes 6 months too early, and that's what we've got to avoid. That is really happening out there now, and I know most of us old riders wouldn't dream of doing an intermediate before we'd done 10 novices. And very often, you can't get 10 novices into a season. So you've got to realize, what is the hurry? Time is, we're very lucky in England, we've got great choice, but time is so important. And always, always, I would say, again, boring old advice, but less is more. It's always better to stop a bit early than to have gone a bit too far. And that's really vital from the safety point of view as well. I think that that's the two things. The horse got to think for himself, and I think he's got to learn at a slower speed. And us riders have got to be just a little bit cooler about not worrying about results. Very much having a plan. Yeah, we all love to win an event. Nice to win an event. But you only need to win one. The rest is, then you can move on. Then you're qualified for whatever final, and you can continue with your horse's education. And I think the modern world doesn't allow from that to be the way to progress. I think the young riders are under so much more pressure to be fancier, to deliver. And that's across the board, whether it's at 80 level or at 5-star level. It's all about being, people talk about being competitive. And I know we've just done equi-ratings, and you're a great example of what I'm not. I would be very, very low on any equi-rating thing anywhere, because I'm not competitive at a have a jump down, or I get
Sam
off
says
time
you're
faults.
really highly rated on equi ratings, so you're wrong.
I don't think I am, but I don't think that's. I'm not really from that era. I think it is fantastic, but it applies to this new world we're in, which is to deliver, doesn't it?
Well, just the one thing I would say on that I was thinking when Sam and Derm were giving their presentation is the problem we have in the States anyway is, and I'd be interested to know if it's the same in France, is if I tell a student that they are not capable to go do the level that they want to do, there's a significant chance in my hometown of Ocala, Florida, that they will say, thank you very much, here's your money for the lesson, I'm going to go ride with the guy down the road who's going to let me go where I want to go. And so I, as a trainer, have to be comfortable with that. But actually, these guys add a whole other layer to the cheesecake. And I can go to that student and say, look, actually, here, that's not just me. I'm not just being a jerk. This here shows you that you need to spend some more time working on some things before you're ready to go.
Yeah, Laurel was talking about the client,
I think.
the client
Thank you,
pressure.
John. Just to introduce a subject. Well, if we talk very quickly about the training methods, of course, there's some details a bit different, but more or less, we talked about it, previously. It's the same, of course. I think, the point I would like to raise is very often is to make the difference between a student and a client. That's interesting. I'm sure that all of us, had this example in mind. And nowadays, there's more and more clients and less students. And to a student, you can ask a lot, and I think most of the people in the room has been students. And it can be tough. Sometimes you can spend 1 or 2 weeks without stirrups. If you are not ready to do the next level, you will wait 1, 2, 3, 1 year if necessary. But as long as the coach say you are not ready, you don't do it. If you are a client, it's getting a bit more difficult, especially if this client has 3-4 horses in the yard and he pays a lot of money every month, and then you will be very kind. And so you say, yeah, it's good, even if it's not really good. And then, it's useless at 2-star level, but he would like to compete at 3-star level. And to be honest, I've done it. I'm not proud of it, and I'm sure that many person here in the room done it as well. And then you say, all right, okay, you're not really ready, but anyway, we'll go. And then sometimes, I think, if we talk and if we come back about the subject, which is safety, it's no good. So I don't have any solution for that, but I think it's important to keep it in mind, especially when you are trainer, coach, just to say, well, sometimes I have to do something which is not exactly what I think, which is not exactly into my philosophy, but I know why I do it. And between that, you have to be very careful, especially when you're on the showground, just to give the proper advice to this person who is not ready to do it, not really ready to do it. And then now we can talk about the course walk, about the warm-up, or some safety instructions, just to say, well, look, if it's not good, you have a few bad jump, maybe it's time to pull out, or whatever, But this is something we have to keep in mind, and I think now we have to deal with, and I think all of them. It's better to have students anyway, But I think it's very important to be aware of it, and especially to keep it in mind. Now, about all the training methods, and just to improve the safety, there's one thing that my 2 colleagues didn't really talk about, is how to improve the rider's balance on the horses, And I think this is maybe one important point before jumping, And you can see that many mistakes which have been done, on the course are due often for some balance mistake anyway in the approach, down the hill, up the hill, you know what it is. So it's important before jumping just to have a lot of training in varied terrain, up and down. Sometimes you have to change a little bit the position, make the stirrups shorter or longer. Well, most of the time it's shorter. Just to make sure that the rider will find his own balance, it will be strong on the horse, and then after it will be able to manage all this up and downhill approaches and so on. That's the first point. Then, obviously, you have to make sure that the rider is able to control the speed and the direction. And then after that, of course, you will start to jump small fences, easy fences first, then combination, and related to the level they try to reach. What else we can say about training skills? I think it's more or less enough. There's one thing I wanted to, which is a bit really different than the US here, but because you said that all the riders, they have most of them, they have their own trainers. I think in France it's quite similar as UK, There's many riders without trainers or coaches or whatever. And sometimes they go just for a lesson, or just for a clinic. And then they just take the trailer, the horse, and they go just alone, sometimes with the father, with the mother, to the competition. I think it's no good, especially with the amateur riders. And then, coming back to the presentation I've done yesterday about what we tried to do with the French Federation, we just insist this year, and it will be compulsory next year from 1st January 2021, that when you want to enter a competition with a club or amateur license, if you don't have a coach, a designed coach, a declared coach, you can't enter your horse. That's it. So we'll leave 1 year just to adjust it. But I think...
So everyone has to have someone that will take responsibility for that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, you can imagine, yeah, I will say, Laurent Bousquet is my trainer. But, of course, the trainer will get a warning just to make sure that he's a proper trainer. So that now with the computer system, it works pretty well and easy. So we hope that it will first help the riders just to have somebody with them and to be aware and to be convinced that they need somebody. And I think it's good for all the coaches as well, because they'll be pushed in front of the scene, and then they will need to work, and then we can probably set up a kind of coaching system. That's the job we have to do this year. That's why we leave 1 year just to implement it. Yeah. So, yeah, that would be good. Probably some people will not be so happy about it, but anyway, that will be compulsory. And you have, because now we have, with our computer and entry system, where you have a line for the rider, a line for the horse, and a line for the coach. And if you don't fill up all the 3 lines, you can click, you will never enter in the competition. So that's the point, and I think it's very important. It's a big change. That's more or less what we can say.
And I think, it's very important when if you've got a coach, you've got someone that you can ask other things to. But there's lots of people who event with a family or just with friends, and there is no one to ask. There isn't anyone they can go to and say, what about fitness or feeding or daily routine, or should I be doing more of this or more of that? I think a lot of certainly the British riders just sort of get on and do it without asking, but without either being able to ask. And I really think that we need to have people like you're doing who are there to offer advice who people feel they can approach without feeling guilty or embarrassed. We even went further and talked about doing some course walks during the day, maybe with riders who aren't necessarily riding, who have maybe got time to walk the course. Because again, lots of people walk a course on their own. And a lot of them, what do they know? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, and just coming back about the coursework, which is, of course, a very important moment, in the weekend. Well, a coursework is not only just having a nice walk with friends in the countryside, but most of the time it's like this. A coursework is a very important moment, and it has to be done very seriously. And the riders has to be taught that they need a plan A, because all the people, when you walk the course, you don't expect any incident, but you need a plan A, and you have to look at a plan B and maybe C, and you have to watch all the different possibilities and options, and even if you don't expect to jump it, But anyway, if something happened during the course, you are ready just to switch to something else. But I guess that if you have some student, most of them, they don't do that.
One thing that we do in the States more and more, and it sort of touches on what this is all about, is if you go to a competition and I see someone out in the field or in the warm-up or in the show jumping and they're riding badly, they're dangerous, they're having a hard time, it's not unusual for myself or another trainer, another professional in the sport to either go up to who we know that person is riding with and say, hey, Sam, your girl who's in the intermediate division is struggling. I saw her out on course. You probably didn't see her. This was the issue. Or if I don't know, I'll go to Marilyn and say, Marilyn, I was watching number 32 in the warm-up for show jumping, and they look pretty scary. Can you make sure you keep an eye on her? And I think it's that a little bit community of realizing that if this person goes out, has a bad go, has a tragic accident, like we were saying earlier, it affects the entire sport, not just nationwide, but worldwide. And so we have to make sure that as you're training your horses, your people, you're also keeping an eye out for other people, and that then if Sam comes to me and says that my best student is riding like a sack of you-know-what, that I don't get my back up and tell him to go pound salt, but I listen to it and then try to go address it. I think that's very important as well.
That doesn't exist here.
It should. It's a big piece.
You keep quiet.
Yeah. It could just be me. I don't keep quiet.
You would be shot.
I think there's a really valid point, and I'd hate it to be an unintended consequence of thinking that what we're aiming for is perfection, because how you learn is from mistakes, but they have to be, it's the right level of mistake. I don't think I'll give an example. When I train in my show jumping, I walk my distances and I know how to ride it, and I often work on my eye using just canter pulls, so I can improve my accuracy using canter pulls. I train cross country on varied terrain, and I will never walk a distance when I set up my cross country pulls, unless I'm doing it for a student and I'm worried. But for myself, because I have to train my horse's reactions and my reactions, and then my balance when I'm not quite there. So putting myself out of the comfort zone, and the message that I would try and put out, and I again have had this conversation with Lucinda, I don't think that training to be perfect every time is correct. And I also don't think that being reckless is correct. I think the art of training is knowing when you can push the comfort zone, when you're ready to be put out of your comfort zone. I think a horse that has just had a few problems on cross country and is feeling quite insecure and quite unsure of what's going on, if my next move is to go and gallop flat out down a hill to a big oxer and tell him, well, he's going to wake up and learn, I don't think he's ready at that point in time. I think I've got to rebuild his confidence. I think I actually need to be accurate and nice and keep it easy. There is an art. I don't think it's black. I don't think it's white. What we're talking about with the XCPI are the extreme cases where you look, and intuitively most people say, one clear in the last 5 or 6 runs and you're stepping up a level. It doesn't make sense. We're talking about outliers. I would get equally worried about someone who's gone clear every time out at 100 and is stepping up to the 2-star level, or stepping up a level thinking that they're absolutely ready. I'd want to know behind the scenes, have you taught your horse to shorten? Have you taught your horse to balance going downhill, to chip in an extra stride when they need to? There's a balance for me between the two. I don't believe in just accuracy, but I do train accuracy ruthlessly. I don't believe in just footwork, but I do train footwork an awful lot as well. So I would train both, and I think it's a combination of both, and that's the art, and that would be the message I'm trying to portray.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really interesting, because that is the modern world. We're all here. It's the Michael Jung era, Mr. Perfect. He does everything perfectly always, and he advocates that. And that isn't, in my opinion, the real world.
He doesn't train that, but he doesn't train that way.
But he talks that way.
He talks that way, but he trains, his training centre. Sorry, his training centre is connected to his school, and and it's really undulating and waters and everything, and he just swings them around, finds them on whatever stride he gets there on. So he trains very much. See, what you and Sam are talking about, to me, is an old generation of feel. Yeah? So where you go with both of your training is about your feel and the horse's feel and the ability to adjust. And that, to me, is slightly what we're losing in eventing, is that we have a much more specific training thing where they train on a flat school and they say that's 3 strides or that's 4 strides and you must be able to hit that all the time.
On being perfect.
On being perfect. Whereas what you're doing is looking to hit that on the 3, the 4 and the 5 and let your horses adjust and be able to balance. I'm quite involved in show jumping as well as eventing, and I think that actually the 2 sports have changed dramatically in the last few years, last 5-10 years, that actually the jumpers work on feel all the time now. I've got, my son works with some decent sort of people, and they're always putting out fences and saying, just go and ride down through that, what would you do differently next time? Is that 5 strides, 6 strides, whatever? Whereas the eventers have got more specific in their training.
Yeah, we've lost that, haven't we?
That's 3 strides, that's 4 strides. Even if they're jumping into water off a 2-metre drop, they still want a specific stride distance on it. Actually, you've got no hope. It's got to be feel. And I think we need to shift our training back to feel so that the riders and the horses develop adjustability, and that will make the sport safer.
Yeah, teach them what it should be, and then be able to adjust, like we were talking earlier, to plan B or plan C. And that is the art. And I'm sure Michael Jung does that more than he's aware. And when you're watching him, he's always on plan A. And that is what the modern world is. The modern world is all about going around on plan A and getting it all right. But that's not always what works.
When things go very wrong for Michael, he's exceptionally good at plan B and plan C, and he even has a plan D.
Yeah, we know he's trained it, but he's not normal.
I just want to come back quickly on what Sam said, about the mistakes. We learn from the mistakes. But I think sometimes you don't learn from the mistake. I think to be able to learn from your mistakes, you need to accept it. You don't say, well, that's my horse. No, you need to accept it. I've done a mistake. Then if you accept it, then you can understand. And your coach, your trainer can help you to understand. And as long as you accept it and you understand it, then you can learn, But again, sometimes you have some riders, they don't accept the mistake. That's my horse, and they never learn. Anyway, they never learn.
I think the answer is you have to train your horses, give them, and yourself, you have to have the information of what the question is you're being asked, and then there has to be some creativity and instinct in what you're doing and react. And you have to train that into them for sure.
Yeah. One thing about what John said at the beginning, when you target a level, hard to train and try to be ready for it. In my opinion, I think, and you should never jump something bigger, and most of the time you have to jump some obstacle which are smaller than the level targeted. And there's many riders, they want to jump big fences, high, just try to be, if I can jump 1.20 m, I will be able to jump 1.10 m. And I think for short jumping, sometimes it can work, not always. I think for cross country, it's a very bad way of doing it because you just get the horse scared on it, and then if they are scared on this, they will be scared on it, And I think it's always better to jump smaller fences as long as you have many different type of fences, profiles, technical questions, and if the horse is able to jump 1 meter, 1.10 m, if he's confident during the competition, he would jump 1.20 m if necessary. And it's something, sometimes the riders, they don't really understand, say, look, I just want to go to this 3-star level, and I just want to jump maybe 3.5 star obstacles. I think it's not good.
The only thing I would say that I would differ slightly from that is if I'm producing a horse or one of my students who's ridden at a significant level is producing a horse, I think that's right. And I certainly, for the cross country, I personally wouldn't jump them at my place. None of my stuff is terribly big. It's all sort of preliminary height or novice height. But I set up the questions that I feel are similar in difficulty to the level we're going to go. But if I have a person who's new to the level, whether they're a kid or an adult, I want to know if they're going to jump a 1.15 m track, that they can jump a 1.15 m at home, at least over the show jumps. Because quite often I've had it happen where I'll have somebody say, I want to go jump the 1.15 m this week and I want to jump around the 3-star. And I'll say, great, let's set that up here in the show jump ring and see how you do. And usually, if I've done my job, they go in there and they can jump it clear or have 1 down, or maybe if it's a bad go, have 2. But sometimes, when you get to that point where you know this isn't really going to go well, but they won't let it go, you set up that 1.15 m track, send them out there, they have 3-4 rails down, and then you have your answer and they have their answer. You don't even have to say it. And hopefully if they go out there and they go well, then they go to the horse show. It's that first time going 3-star, and they're not entering the ring jumping the biggest track of their life. I don't want to go to the horse show knowing that my student has to have the performance of their life to get around. I want them to be able to go out there and just do what they do at home, maybe not quite what they do at home, and they're going to be safe and good.
Any question? Very clear.
All right, comments or questions? No? Thank you very much, guys. Great.
Thank you.
That's what we're all here for, is different views from around the world. So I think that was pretty fascinating. Coffee? Anybody want coffee? Yes. You want to move? You want to move? All right, so coffee, we'll come back here in half an hour, and we'll just, we'll have the presentations from the groups of what you guys have thought. So everybody's got a leader of who's going to present what they said. That'll be quite quick. Thank you. This is our last session. This is now everybody split up into the working groups that they signed up for. When I walked around, the level of the conversation sounded really, really good. So we're going to be very interested to see what came out of those. And so our first subject was medical coverage at events, and our two doctors. Ex-medical officer of the FEI, former, so medical officers of the FEI. But what did your group discuss?
Well, our group actually discussed medical cover at competitions, and it was quite interesting that a survey went out to the NFs from eventing recently. Everybody indicated they had problems with medical cover, varying around the world and everything. So we felt this was really an important subject to cover on this. Now, Mark has made the notes. Mark is now taking over from me as chair, so I'll let him go through the summaries, and I'll butt in now and then as I do.
Okay. Annex D in the eventing rules is unique to eventing, and it's not applicable to the other disciplines. And obviously, I think we have some medical. We have some medical issues that aren't available in show jumping and dressage. The FEI, by having this annex, wants to provide kind of templates and guidelines and minimum requirements for FEI events around the world. But as we all know, that's quite variable from jurisdictional restrictions to what is available in different regions. What kind of prompted a lot of this was the coroner's inquest from Australia, because they didn't necessarily provide some of the answers that we need, but they asked the right questions. So to do that, we have to make it simple and kind of general, because the FEI is going to provide through this annex guidelines to the national federations, which are actually the organizations that have to implement these changes. So from an organizational point of view, we thought two things need to happen right away. First of all, any FEI organizing committee should appoint a chief medical officer to assist them in actually providing adequate coverage. And that chief medical officer doesn't necessarily need to be a physician. It needs to be somebody who's involved in the equestrian community, knows what the medical needs would be, is local so they know the resources that are available. The second thing that needs to be done is a serious incident management plan, a SIM. And that's key, and I think the coroner's report brought some of this out, is this needs to be done prospectively. You can't have a serious incident and then figuring out, who's going to do what, how it's going to all come together, who's going to do, from an organizational point of view, the communications, the actual management of an injured athlete or a horse for that matter, or something else that happens at a competition. The other thing that we wanted to do in this guideline is probably provide a minimum requirement for the safety of our FEI athletes. And because of jurisdictional differences, their titles are different in Australia as they are in the United States, Colombia, or something else. So we had to come up with a broader concept and not necessarily titles. So what we're going to try to do is talk about minimum skill sets that need to be on the site to take care of our athletes. And that has to be, I think, we've decided they have to be able to protect the airways, which is essential. So either intubation or surgical airway. They have to be able to decompress a tension pneumothorax, where you crush your chest and you basically can't breathe. You can't wait until they get to the hospital. They actually have to be able to put on pelvic binders, start IVs, and to give certain medications. So what we feel the FEI can provide guidance to the national federations is this is the minimum that the medical personnel on site need to be able to do to make this a safe environment for them. I think that that's an obligation that we all feel. We don't want to get too much into the weeds and limit what national federations can do within their own resources that they have. There's financial constraints, there's geographical constraints of what personnel are available. So we want to leave it broad enough that we don't handcuff national federations, yet there are some minimal requirements that have to be done. The other thing that we can do to help with this is we hope to provide templates, like what is a CMO? And we'll probably have a template to go, okay, these are the requirements, or not really requirements, the recommendations of what that person should be able to do. We will give you examples of serious incident management plans from other organizations around the world. So for the organizers, so they don't have to spend the extra time, let's start with some examples that are out there, and then you can apply them to your particular event that's going on. The other thing that we talked about real briefly is that I know it's a controversy is concussion recognition, management, and return to play. We just want to remind everybody that on the FEI website, the concussion protocols are actually there. We'll include this in, which we already have, what is called the doctor's packet on the FEI website. But we want the organizers and the officials to also know what the procedures are, how you can diagnose it, when we have to report it, but just as importantly from a national federation level, when can you let that athlete who has had a concussion safely come back and compete? So.
The other thing I'd like to say, we had a discussion on training of chief medical officers, and we think the FEI can really help here by doing some online training for people who wish to be chief medical officers at events. It will ensure they understand the rules, these protocols for concussion, referrals, and what quality of staff they really ought to have with them. So again, we need to look at that in the same way the vets have actually looked at training of treating vets. We ought to be doing something along those lines now to actually help organisers who can take CMOs or have their own CMOs, come online, look through some educational things there and familiarise themselves with the problems they may encounter if they're new to the sport, or sort of just remind people what they're doing.
So the other thing is we would like, just from the broader group here too, is what we can do as the FEI Medical Committee to help the national federations, do their jobs better. So things will come up, whether it's rules, whether it's protocols or things. The bigger national federations are, running along pretty good, but I think sometimes we forget the limited resources that some of our smaller national federations have. And if that's the case, we're here to help. I mean, if they want to do it right, we know they want to do it right, they have a limited number of people in their NFs, we'll do anything we can to kind of help them move forward, but they have to ask.
I don't know if anybody's got any questions they'd like to raise now. It is dark, it's getting late.
We promise to keep it down.
Thank you. Now, I think from where Australia led us to and those questions that were asked, I think this is a good direction, and certainly feel very comfortable about the direction that's going on to make it more specific. The dressage group, next, yeah? Who's presenting for that? Nick and Sandy. There we go. Just walk the catwalk. Tell me about it, it's a long walk. Don't tell me about it. You want? I even put my trainers on.
Thank you. Now we know why you wore trainers on the second day.
Absolutely.
You're going to get corns. Our group was the dressage test improvements and any possibilities of increasing entertainment, perhaps with music within eventing dressage. Our discussions were lengthy because we're dressage people, so you can imagine how we went on and on. The current technical tests that we use, we feel need to relate to the jumping phases and the principles of event horse training, being currently trained. However, suppleness and balance with imaginative lines, not just boring, just exercises, but imaginative lines with emphasis on the quality on the way of going, rather than constantly making the tests more difficult. So, in our discussions about the dressage to the music and freestyle, it became a bit more complicated because we kept thinking, well, actually, in that you've got choreography, you've got degree of difficulty, and you've got interpretation of the music. And those take time to learn, and they also take away from the event horse and what he should be doing in the other phases. We also felt you need judges that can judge choreography, degree of difficulty, and interpretation, and not all event judges can do that at the highest level. So we did have quite a debate about that.
No, we decided that it wasn't relevant.
Oh. We decided it wasn't relevant. Do you want to talk a bit about your electronic stuff, and then I'll come back to the... So the answer is apparently no.
Well, we were sticking to the basis of dressage and eventing really is about making the horses more adjustable and more balanced to be able to do the jumping part of the competition. So in terms of writing new tests in the future, we talked about incorporating lots of different movements. So saying do a leg yield to a shoulder in to a half pass, incorporating shoulder in to renvers to shoulder in again. So changing things often to make riders have to ride their horses more and make them more used to the aids and improve the suppleness and adjustability. Using forward and back, a lot of forward and back, using lines from the corner to A, extended canter, maybe going into a smaller circle with haunches in, developing that to a half pass, lots of things like that to really improve adjustability. We then talked about, for spectators, live scoring was really important, which we do have. The ability to show the current score and also have the leader's score up there with the running score of the present combination. That is done in some of the competitions, but I don't think not in all, not 5 stars, and we thought it would be good for 5 stars and championships to start with. The ERM does have spectator judging, which I think I'm told was first very popular and then maybe not so popular, but I feel if we're talking in 10 years' time, probably that I think it would be something that would really involve the audience, and with the way that we're going in dressage judging, we're going to paperless judging, so that means having iPads, which improves the scores. They come up straight away, and then you can involve the spectator judging with that, and I think it would make everything more inclusive. In terms of something new down the line, we talked about the possibility of putting a joker line in at the end of the test.
Rather than a freestyle, but
Yes.
having an element that was potentially for bonus points, rather than having a totally freestyle test that is way into the world of dressage, but actually a joker line of something, something that would be a higher risk that the rider could choose to take or not to take, but it's not like having choreography and difficulty in music that somebody has to interpret and give scores for, right?
Yeah, so you would have a committee that would decide what movements would be applicable for that level, and obviously we'd start at 5 star and see how it worked. So whether you had tempi changes or whether you had quarter pirouettes or whatever you wanted to decide was applicable, then you had your joker line to do it, and if you're successful, you had the possibility of having a coefficient and a much higher score, which would make it interesting.
Yeah. So that was what we came up with as a slightly more workable option for eventing, rather than having all of that technical, subjective stuff in freestyle, and also freestyle judging in those artistic marks. They are really very subjective. So we would end up probably in eventing having really wide differences with the scores, which makes nobody happy. Owners, sponsors, riders. It's the one thing that makes people unhappy in the dressage phase, is having big differences in the scores. So we came up with the idea of having that as a possibility. What else did we come up with? Headphones and commentaries, always good. They've been around for years. They've got to be positive. We can't have people, experts from outside the sport in dressage or whatever it is, being negative or making negative comments about the judges, which of course is not so great. Also, you know, when riders are interviewed after big dressage tests in 5 stars or championships, like TV coverage, it's really important that that interviewer at your event, 5-star event, is briefed to be positive and not to try and encourage the rider to criticize the judges, to criticize the marks. Okay, you know, we're big and ugly enough, we can cope with it, but it doesn't look good for the sport. It's not a positive image for the sport if they're criticizing the judges or the scores, or if the commentators and the people in the earpieces are making negative comments about the riding or the horses or the sport. So it's really important that we keep that side positive, yeah? Anything else? Any jokers?
No, I think
we also, just as now that we can change the mark for the flying changes, if there is an anomaly of 3 marks or more, I personally have been involved with this at 2 5-star events in 2019, 2 slightly different systems of doing it, but it worked really well. We had very few to change, but it was perfectly understandable why we had to change the mark. It was the way the judge was sitting here and the flying change was here, or whatever it was. We understood why we missed it, and I'm happy to say one of them, I think it was me. So we changed the mark. The rule is changed now so that we can have the correct mark for all 3. We don't have to go with the average, because if 2 people are wrong, then we haven't got the right score. So now that rule is clear. But we discussed as well between us as judges whether we should bring it now down to 2 marks difference, not 3 marks. But that was something perhaps for further discussion rather than to, just for further thought, because the difference at the end of the marks doesn't make that much difference. But actually to a rider, when they see a 4, a 6 and a 4, it doesn't look right, and it isn't right. Somebody's made a mistake. So it'd be better if we could even have it even more clear. Yeah?
Yes.
Any questions?
Questions? Well done. Like it.
Dressage is leaving.
I'm sure that the Frangible Technology Group is going to be just as entertaining. So the group who's presenting about your discussions on frangible technology, Jonathan, David? 2 of you? Yep.
All right, I'm going to start at the end and go backwards. Oh, I left a sheet here. So starting at the end, thank you. Starting at the end, there was pretty unanimous view that given the work that we've been doing and where we are now with the new standard, that needs to get approved and released as soon as possible so that we can get the new devices or the new required improvement devices out there into the field. And in particular, it is driven by, you know, this year, everything that's coming up this year, an Olympics year, and a number of events that are set up for the spring, and people wanting to use solutions that were either already pretty well proven and this close in the past or used in the past, but now being able to do it fully sanctioned and fully supported by a new standard. So that was really nice to hear, and I think that's a super important aspect. So then going backwards down the list, there was also a pretty strong opinion that there's no need to keep the requirement for frangible devices where they can be used and requiring them to be used only at 4 and 5 star, but push it all the way down to 1 star. So all FEI competitions should have that requirement. When a fence is built and it can use a frangible device, it should use it. Pretty good discussion on how many penalties should be awarded. Anything between 0 and I guess the biggest number we talked about was 20. There's a pretty good consensus that the 11 penalties is a good number. And in particular, one major driver being, or the major driver being, there has to be, in order to learn, when we make our mistakes, there has to be a penalty. If we make mistakes and there's no penalty, you basically don't learn. And I can show you some math that can prove that. And I'm dead serious. I mean, if you Google Dave Voss and unicycle robot, you'll see it on YouTube. And that unicycle robot I built as part of my PhD, and it had a learning algorithm, is learning the friction on the ground. And if there's no penalty, it just falls over. So it's real no nonsense. Field lessons for implementing the building of the fences, that there's really a sort of a missing link there. It would be super nice if we had an easy, simple repository where people could say, hey, when I put this screw in here and I tried to mount that bracket, it just didn't work, and here's a much easier way. How do we get that back to the community and in particular to the people who make the frangible devices, and so that new instructions can be amended and the process can be updated and we can be constantly learning from the field. 2 more quick items. A really important one was training builders and TDs and so on, the officiating community, on what the frangible device needs to look like when it's installed. And so that when questions come up, or if someone is in charge of approving an installation, they need to know what it is they're looking at and how to even judge, is this good or bad or not. So that seems really important for us to get in place. And then a really interesting concept that actually was a bunch of discussion on was some kind of a fast-track approval process for questions surrounding a perturbation on an existing approved device that's out there. So we've done this a few times where I got a phone call from key people and we worked through it really quickly in a day or two and came out with a solution that could go into the installation in the field. It obviously has to be contained. It can't be, you know, hey, I have this new idea. Can we try it out on Saturday in the FEI 5-star? That's definitely not what we're aiming at here. But for an approved, qualified device, if there's some hiccup that's being run into and we can figure out a solution, we really do need that fast-track group of people. And I think it's Jonathan. The group right now is Jonathan, myself, Mark, and Mike. And I think we're all up for doing that. But I think what we want to do is make that official. So there's sort of a phone number available that we can be reached at, and we can quickly answer difficult questions and come up with a resolution. And the answer might well be no, that no, you cannot do that. Or it could equally well be yes, there's a way to do this, and we can get this problem resolved and implemented quickly. And it's an approved process. In other words, there are people seriously looking at it, going and if necessary, doing some evaluations and then coming back with an answer that says yes or no. And you know, doing that is obviously, it cannot be an arbitrary process. It has to be quite strict in the sense that we do not want to make changes that are so dramatic that running a really important event, we make a change and then in fact we put out a parachute that's full of holes and doesn't work. So it's really important to keep it formal, but just get the attention span and the focused timeline really quick so that we can address those kinds of issues. That's all I had. Did I miss anything?
I think the one thing was that when David Evans was there and he said course builders don't read, so it'd be nice if they could have videos of how to fit these things.
Yeah, that was definitely a bit of a surprise. I thought it was only the Generation Z that doesn't read and only watches videos, but I mean, 100%. So what Matt showed in terms of the assembly animations, but making it such that, in fact, it's easy for someone to follow that animation and implement it and build it to the requirements. In other words, if this is 20 centimeters, it needs to be said. It has to be placed at 20 centimeters. Anything else?
The only other thing was there's going to be a big responsibility on the TDs here to pass these devices. So I think it's very important they get some training.
We had a few discussions on the ground line point, but I think that's a little bit separate from the frangible topic, so we'll table that for the moment. Questions?
Perfect. Questions? Question? Yeah, there's a question. Mark.
Sam Watson, Ireland. The way the device is fitted, that can affect what pressure it takes to activate the device. So would we consider ever auditing the fitting, that there could be a random test? Because Dave, you have a test that's basically mobile, that the grand jury could maybe occasionally, I know we've got to be cost effective here, but we could sponsor a few audits, because there has been a concern that some devices have activated too easily, and that maybe if there was a system of testing these devices in the field, it would be interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. We've talked about that in the US in our safety committee, and the kettlebell being so inexpensive and available, every facility or course building facility should have one kind of in the back of the truck. And it's particularly useful in the event that something happens in an event, and then you can go and test it and see, well, that fence seemed like it was causing a bunch of trouble. Let's go and test it exactly as it is on Monday and see what we have here, because that way we can drive those learnings back. I will say, though, from the qualifications point of view, we really should strive to, when we go through the process of getting the qualification set of data and saying, yes, this device works and it meets the requirements, it needs to be pretty thorough, so that there's not a hell of a lot of continuous maintenance testing required in the field, because that becomes pretty difficult and a little bit arbitrary. So it's definitely something to keep in mind and try to figure out how to balance.
I think Vince Roach, Australia. I think the kettlebell idea is a great idea. However, that only tells us that it will go off. It doesn't show us if it is too sensitive. Do we have a test for that? Because that's more likely to be the problem if we're overactivating. From a safety point of view, we want to know that it's not underactivating. But how can we tell if it's coming down a lot, whether it's overactivating?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a really good question, but this is the beauty of the kettlebell. So you can test it just by pulling it back different distances, how much energy you're impacting it with, and you can determine at which point it's releasing. So it's not just a test on the upside, it's on the maximum level. You can test incrementally by 2 centimeter increments in how high you pull it back, and it changes it by 20 joules. So you can do those kinds of increments all across the range and find exactly where it is releasing. And don't forget the requirement of minimum, the rotten log test, the 165 joules below which it cannot fail, that's still part of the requirement for qualifying.
Thank you.
David, further to that good suggestion from Vince, and keeping in mind that TDs obviously read a lot more than course builders, is there an animation or a video of that kettlebell setup that we can see somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. We have John Hollings here somewhere, I think. He has the answer on the US websites. We have it. I think FEI, we're going to put it up if it's not already up. But that's part of the documentation on how to do the test. It includes a video of me on my farm showing how to use it.
Yeah, it's done with a tractor, meter-long chain, and then pulling it back a certain degree. And that video is on the usea.org in the United States. And again, it's something that is very amenable to anybody doing it. And also, you can test, as David has talked about, you can test different levels. And the math supports it. useventing.com. There you go.
And we will update that. I think the original one that's up there was at, I forget now, 200 joules, but we have a document that describes exactly the height that you have to raise the kettlebell to in order to get the 160, the 250, and the 400 joules. That's part of the new release of of the standard.
One of the things we're going to have to look at here is the weight of the rail is actually critical. So if you have a really lightweight rail, light density rail, it's going to break a lot easier than when you have a rail of a heavier mass. So when we eventually come out with this, we're going to have to quantify a range of weight for the rail to which this is going to meet the standard. Otherwise, if the rail is too light, you will get breakages that are too easy.
And just remember, that's a huge difference between a green log, a wet log, and a dry log. So it will change in your same design over the year to year to year. Your log changes, and so there is a mathematical formula that is also, again, on the same thing in the guidelines that we have published in the United States about different types of wood, how to measure it, how to measure the weight, and their change from green, freshly cut, down to something that is 2 years old that is now dry.
So to be clear on that, it's not super critical. In other words, there's a pretty good range over which things will work. But when you get to the edge cases, when you get really heavy or really light, actually it's on the really heavy side that it begins to dominate. Then we need to be quite specific. So that's part of what the qualification process would be. For example, MIMS and BE and anyone else building such a device. That's how we would be sure to qualify. This is the range within which this device is qualified to use in terms of rail mass, and that it must be met.
Anybody else? Great. Well, thank you, guys. Great for all weekend. Super. And that just leads into the cross-country design group that had their conversation. You guys ready? Who's doing that? Does she know that? There we go. Welcome, Helen.
Feel a bit lonesome up here. Everyone else had a mate. Okay, so the cross-country design group. Thank you, Mark. We started by discussing rule changes for 2020, which inevitably led to a fair bit of time talking about the dreaded flag rule. Just out of interest, in the room here, having watched the video footage of the various flags, how many of you are put your hand up if you are not concerned about the beginning of the season and the uncertainty surrounding it? Oh, good old Eric. You're not. Brilliant. Okay. That's about 3 hands. So there is obviously a fair amount of uncertainty amongst the officials, which concerns us for the riders heading to Tokyo, etc., etc. There's obviously still uncertainty around this. That led us on to talk about the flag falling and getting penalties for it. We talked about, obviously, there's benefits to that. There's potential training benefits, promoting a better picture. If the horses are obviously given more time, presented square on, making a better picture in the air, less awkward jumps potentially. But to enable this, we felt that obviously every flag would have to be consistent on the day, and the resistance of the flags would need to remain the same throughout the day. And inevitably, as designers, we felt that the course design aspect of it would need to change. So interestingly, when we went around the room, all bar one were not in favour of this. I'm now looking at Matt, who's glaring at me because I know that obviously Sweden are going to go with that this year, so it will be really interesting to see how that does pan out. But the main reason that, as designers, we felt we didn't want to go down that route was the way it would make riders ride. We were worried that they would get backward, and it would not encourage forward riding. So that was ultimately, we didn't want to see that picture. Anything else to add on that, Mark? We then went on and talked about some concepts and the number of efforts. We all supported the concept of ditches and steps not counting as efforts. We felt that that would help us as designers to potentially introduce some of the sort of more old-fashioned obstacles, your sunken roads, which in effect would then help educate the young horses. Brilliant for their footwork, and also educate the riders in terms of actually teaching them what gears they need to be selecting for certain questions, especially at the lower levels, which would then obviously impact on up through the levels. So yeah, and obviously we felt that just because potentially we've gained a couple of efforts, it doesn't mean that then as a designer you have to use them. It's having the discretion and the knowledge to use them when you need to. There's obviously a lot more work to do to that proposal, but it was just interesting that the tone of the room was very much in support of it. Our third point was courses at the lower levels. We looked at the idea of each track having a certain number of core fences, whether, for example, a sunken road, a coffin, a bounce, and yeah, whether each track at a certain level should have to have a certain number of those core elements to teach horses to adjust, to be reactive, and to promote better riding skills. We also looked at the design of the fences that we're using to achieve this at the lower levels, and all agreed that, you know, the education system is essential to teach and educate designers, and the progression of young horses. Educating young horses to prepare them for the next level has to be the key objective, which again led us with the skinny debate about not going too skinny, not trying to catch young horses out. Sorry, having page issues. And ultimately, substandard courses absolutely cannot be allowed. Fences have to be up to height at the appropriate level. We talked about organiser pressures, rider pressures. As an organiser, I know some of us certainly feel pressure from riders looking for an easy qualification, and with an organiser hat on and viability, you know, I'm not going to lie, you have to it does go through your head. And certainly, you know, riders with producing young horses potentially maybe looking for easier tracks to keep it clear on their cross-country record. So there's all these different pressures that ultimately must not impact on the level of the course. It has to be true. Might be something equi-ratings can help us with, actually. We discussed briefly the value of the data collection, whether we should look at recording all fence dimensions, so including the jumpable width, and whether that would give us any more information that obviously we could collate and analyse trends. It was just a thought. Skinnies, we all agreed, obviously not going too skinny, and we unanimously supported the motion that the minimum jumping widths increase by 5 centimetres. Yeah, 10. Oh, God, I've got my 5s and 10s wrong. Obviously, we've got the range, and at the lower end of the range, you know, if you're approaching it off a straight line, great, but then to have the upper end of the range to be approaching something off a turn to give the horses more time to actually read the question. Point 6, we thought better communication between designers, filtering down and sharing our experiences and lessons learnt. I'm not privy to Mike and Mark's WhatsApp group, so, you know, apparently I'm too young. But, you know, when you actually, just observations, you know, we learn so much from watching horses jump around the courses, and, you know, to filter back really important lessons is key. And I would just urge as a sort of, you know, trying up-and-coming designer to hear any of that input is a massive, massive help. And then our last point was succession planning. How do we encourage new designers into the sport? You know, it is difficult to get into. Interestingly, we talked about the current rules surrounding the conflict of interest and how riders are possibly being hindered from getting on into the course design route because they're not allowed to then obviously ride tracks they've designed. And we just questioned whether at the lower levels that needs to stay in place. It was just a thought. We felt that potentially it might be closing a few doors that could be explored. So yeah, that was. Anything to add, Mark? Any questions?
Great, thank you. I'm going to commit myself. Yeah, I'm actually going to commit myself. There's lots of us that do believe that a course designer should be able to ride over their courses at the lower levels. At short formats, not in a championship, not long formats, not any of those type of things. So we brought it up to the FEI several times and been beaten down every single time. And so I'm going to commit myself. I encourage the national federations to do this in their own programs. And your national classes, if you have national classes in the lower levels, I would encourage that you actually do allow your course designers to ride over your own courses. I know in the United States we go down this road that we don't do it at a long format, we don't do it at championships or even area championships that we have in the States, but in a regular national horse trials through the levels and those lower levels, please let your riders write a rule that allows riders to start their course design career while they're still riding. So I can tell you right now that we're not going to get that through the FEI, but I would encourage your national federations to do it because I think it is really, really important that while you're still riding, because we want riders to be course designers, while you're riding to be able to start your career, and because it takes a long time to learn. So I'm going to encourage national federations that don't have that rule already, some do, but that they go down that road. They're just pure than when they wrote a conflict of interest policy a couple years ago. The other sports said they want it consistent, and they have just outright turned it down every single time. I'm just telling you. So it's an upper, and I've tried it in every single aspect that I could and argued it, but they when they wrote that conflict of interest policy, and we say that short format thing that we have is not, it's something that we are completely willing to accept that. At the 1 and the 2 and the 3-star level, nothing. So I'm just going to encourage the national federations to be able to do it in their own countries. That'll make the live stream buzz a little bit. Yeah. So we are now on statistics, I think. Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, our group had started with the equi ratings, and we had a long discussion. I don't really know where we ended there, but anyway, we had some discussions about the cost, and the NFs that are using equi ratings are very happy with it and find it's well invested money. And the data can be used for a lot of things, not just prevention of horse falls. It's for PR reasons, media, coaching, etc. So mainly very positive responses from the NFs. We had an academic discussion about the predictability for the horse falls. So Sam is now back, and he... No, we left the question there. Next subject that we were talking about were the horse injuries. And everybody felt that needs to be improved. But also everybody felt there is problems with the reporting. The injuries between slight and serious, like tendons, suspensories, so on and so forth, they are very hard to catch. We were talking about sort of a mandatory follow-up, but we ended on that we need to focus on the injuries, the more serious injuries that are happening at the field of play. And we need to categorize them, what we think injuries that has a short-term effect of the career, long-term effect of the career, career ending, and fatalities. And those injuries should be reported, and we felt that those are relevant. The last part we were talking about were the officials. We think that we can improve the level of the officials and some sort of a quality control. And those officials that came up during the discussions were dressage judging, deviations in judging, and course designers, fall rates, refusals, blah, blah, blah. So, did I forget anything from my group? Yeah. Questions? Thank you.
Just out of interest a little bit, that we've already started in these last years about being, from a course designer point of view, we're using statistics and having a rating for, not a rating, but just because it's for self-information. Right now, we've started that over the last 2 years about giving course designers the information from where they have been in the last couple of years about fall rates, run-out rates, and things like that. And you know, the first reaction was a little bit emotional, and now it's becoming that it's actually part of the system that people are, oh, that's good. It makes them think, which is all you're trying to do is get them to ask the questions to themselves. So that is a program that works and can be expanded maybe into some of the other officials, but it actually is a very beneficial thing once the first emotional reaction comes. It's a very beneficial program. Vince?
Vince Roach, Australia. What about an anonymous reporting system for horse injuries? Obviously, there are all sorts of commercial ramifications of named or identifiable horses injured. But what about an anonymous system where people could anonymously go online and report an injury? At least, I don't know, it's a thought.
I think, Tim, you alluded to that in your presentation, didn't you, Tim? I mean, or something, or recommendation, part of your recommendation?
Yeah, and we discussed it a little bit in the group, and clearly that would encourage people to report. You'd have very little understanding of exactly how much underreporting there still existed. What it would provide is would give you an idea of the level of risk at different events. The one thing that I caution with respect to that, and when we've done all the work with the racing industry, is that what you want to avoid is actually ascribing risk to a particular location when you've got different types of horses going to different locations that may be predisposed in themselves to different levels of risk. So we have certain race courses in this country where there is undoubtedly a greater risk of fracture, but the population of horses that genuinely often commonly go to that race course may be a different population of horses. They may be an older population that have a higher risk of fracture themselves. So it may not be something attributable to the actual event. So we want to avoid being able, laying blame at individual event locations as being very risky locations. That's not, in anyone's interest really. The other thing about anonymous reporting is that then that does stop. Essentially, all you end up being able to do is put a level of risk at that particular event. It doesn't enable you to then go on and say, what are the factors that increase the likelihood of particular outcomes at that, because then you don't know who the horse is, or what the horse is. So there are pros and cons, and we did discuss it a little bit, but
And the group's sort of decision was a little bit, you didn't know whether you were collecting 10% of the of the injuries or 100% of the injuries. So one event might have 50 horses that were injured, and one might have 3 horses that were injured, but actually, in actual fact, the one that had 3 horses that reported were worse. You see what I mean? So you've got doesn't give you any factual evidence that you can use because you don't know how many horses have been reported out of the number of horses that have been injured.
Might just study this to be a little inventive here, right? And we talk about anonymous, but couldn't we do some maybe researching through surveys and all anonymous surveys and stuff like that, and actually say at the end of the year, and say, hey, what's your rate here, or and maybe to see if riders would actually be more willing to do it anonymous. I mean, not tagging to the horses, but so that we could find out a little bit more data about the injury rates. I mean, I have views of different things with, especially with weather.
I think that's a good idea. What you could do is sort of say you'd have a register of horses that are competing at the beginning of the season, then you send out an anonymous questionnaire sort of saying, is your horse still competing? What's up with it? Is it going to appear next year? Exactly the sort of thing. That would be a nice idea. Yeah.
That's Andrew Fell from Ireland. It was basically similar to what we were saying. We could maybe look at the results and see from the events where if these horses have been competing for several years and then all of a sudden they disappear. Ask the question why. Get in contact with the riders and say what's happened to that horse.
And I know the U.S. did you use equi ratings, Eric? Eric, did you use equi ratings for the return? But let's say just return to play as the first question. That was you did a thing this winter. I thought that was quite good in the United States, and they did a return to almost like just trying to track horses how often they return. Did you use?
So I have no response on that because it was done through the USCA, and I just got the information separately, so can't speak about it. Good though.
Yeah, there was a study in the U.S. about horses returning to play and why aren't they? And they did it through other countries, and so there's a start. It's one of the questions that you could ask.
Maybe a way of going about it would be to develop a culture that it was okay to do that. Many, many decades ago in Australia, there was a vet called Wayne Backhouse who, at one of the major 3-day events, followed horses in the following weeks and ran tests on them to see the effect long term, not just on the day, but the recovery rate and the different cellular things that were happening to horses over a number of weeks. So there could be a study started where you choose an event and say, who is willing to be part of this study where we do this and follow up your horses for a couple of weeks, gaining information for you to help your horse's recovery, but also it might have a side effect of helping people start to trust that what's going to happen with the information that they're giving you. It might just work.
Yeah, I think
we would have lots of data on that.
I think this weekend, it's kind of got us all going a little bit in circles. This is something that we don't know enough about, right? And so how do we actually start to find information that we can know more about it? Okay, next, officials' roles. You up by, okay. Don't need another one?
Just me. I wasn't going to say this, but the last time I had a microphone in my hand with David in the room, I was singing. I shan't be doing that. We were talking about the roles of officials, and with the premise that everybody does the best they can with what they've got, we're trying to discuss and come to an agreement of what levels we want people to come to. So rather than report on where we're at and where we need to go, we're reporting on the optimum that we want to see happening. We want to be seeing officials that are suitably qualified and experienced to be part of the role. And I think when we're talking, the subject that David introduced a little earlier was, and I understand where it's coming from, I've even heard it on the sides, what are they doing walking the course? They don't know anything about what they're doing. Now, rather than have the tail wag the dog, when that happens, we need to make sure that the officials that we have are suitably experienced and suitably qualified. And I think that's changing, and I think it's starting to happen better with the more strict criteria and more strict examinations and education at the seminars that we go to these days. The other thing could be, and I talked to Grania about this a little bit earlier, that how we advertise what we're doing as officials and what the program is that we have. You don't want to have a lecture where we sit there and we get lectured at about what we're doing, but people these days want it as instant. They want to see little clips and grabs about what's happening. It's all over Instagram when something goes wrong. Why don't we start putting something over social media ourselves and start
wagging the tail instead of the tail wagging the dog. Our group was quite unified, which was really good to see, because as officials, that was one of the things that we thought was optimum, that the team had really good teamwork. There was professionalism. These were optimum things to have, and if that wasn't present, then things were likely to start going astray, and as they had, and we all have different personalities, we all have different ways of doing things, we all need to learn to get on with each other in a professional setting and not say, oh, your mark was this, you're wrong, or what do you think about that? We need to be able to discuss, what did you see here, what do you think there? And I think that's why, for many of us, when we were thinking about the president role and the ground jury roles, I think as ground jury members, we wanted to be unified and be part of the group with supporting the president supporting us. Not just that, the communication between the TD and the course designer and the organisers. You know, there's a serious role that the organisers have in here, inviting us to do this. We say it's on our head what happens, but in actual fact, there's a lot of it comes back to the organiser. It's on the organiser's head what's right and what's wrong and what comes out of their competition. So I think it's important, and everyone hears communication is the best thing, but real communication, respectful communication, and honest communication, and harking back to the training session, when they can pay you to give the opinion they want, we've got to stop that. Rules, we need to know the rules and we need to stick to them. It's actually quite simple if you stick to them and you don't bend them at one competition because, oh, so-and-so did it. I was at a competition where somebody had a stop at the fence, came round and tried the next one down and had a stop, came round and tried the next one down and had a stop, then jumped it. And we stopped, oh, I saw so-and-so do that, who was an Olympian, at such and such an event. So we need to all be uniform in the way we know the rules and we apply the rules. Course walking, we need to be able to have proper communication, and it's not just one area that needs to make sure it's all happening. The course designer needs to be there, needs to be willing to tell us what's going on. We need to be there and not gossiping and trailing behind and talking about whatever. We need to be on the job. It's not ideal if we have to walk several courses at once, but sometimes time doesn't allow us not to do that. So that real conversation, I often, and I'm walking a course and we think, oh, I think this flower could go there, and I'm thinking, well, that's a lot of rot, really. Does it make any difference at all? Let's talk about the real things. Let's find out what they're talking about. Let's have that professional dialogue, and for all of us, learning more. And I was lucky enough last year to go with some really good course designers and listen to what they were talking about when we were walking the courses at some very big events. So you were one of them, buddy. And that was a good learning experience. That mentoring of judges, that succession planning of how we get more people into the sport. What's our plan to do that? How do we make it so that people want to do it? When I talked at a forum some time ago, a dressage forum, and I was talking about becoming a dressage judge. No one was becoming a dressage judge, but they were all becoming stewards. So why aren't people coming to the role? What do we need to do with the role to make them want to come and join us? We could also have, and this happened at Adelaide, where the commentary from the FEI was explaining what would happen next. So if this happened to somebody, or they had a flag missing or whatever, the commentary said, this will happen, this is what the judges will do after this. So that once again, we're giving information to the public, not the public telling us, well, what would they know? This is supposed to happen, what did they do? So we're giving them the script of how we're going about it, which in the end, if they get enough education, enough information, it surely could help, or I could just be an infants primary teacher in Pixieland, who knows? I was talked about the organiser's involvement. The TDs suggested that all the ground jury reports go straight to the FEI, because if they don't go to the TD gets the president's report, they know it's positive. If they don't get it, because it's sent straight to the FEI, they know it's not. So they get this bit of a, I didn't get the report, it must be bad. So I guess it's for all of us, that feedback about knowing whether we've done a good job, how we could do it better, that open communication, so that by the end, it's like, as a school teacher and a school principal, no parent at the end of the year should find out that their kid's behind. They should know all along the way how they're going. So we should be able to have those conversations with people. If we've got something we're worried about, we should be able to communicate and say, what about this? How are we going with that? Anything else? You fall asleep.
No. I'm trying to follow. I think you given an idea of what we were talking about in that group. I think was the important thing. I think was that when we asked all the officials in that group, which was quite a large group, the main thing was the concern, the teamwork.
Yes.
That was the most important thing, that the team works between the officials, that works.
Yeah.
The communication between the TD, and the ground jury and the course designer, and that you feel confident and secure in that role as an official within the team. It's a team effort. I think that's the key message.
And that's what the communication was about, being part of that team.
Great. Athlete education. This John Laurent. Can you guys put yourselves in order of height if you're going to talk exactly since you guys?
Well, we're back on board. Well, so we have this working group, and first of all, I would like to thank all the people who contributed to this working group. Thank you to all of you. So, obviously, we talk about most of the topics, what we said previously, 1 hour ago. So I don't think
Don't
it's...
wanna hear it again.
I hope we've been clear. So I think it's not necessary to repeat it once again. But there's few details maybe who came up from the discussion. Have a look at the minutes, My brain is a bit, flat
Can
at
you
this
read
time.
that writing?
Hmm?
It's quite difficult to read.
Yeah. Well, we...
I couldn't read it.
There was something good, coming from Andrew, from the racing world. Yeah, is here, especially because we try to compare with the professional jockeys, and before having, if I really understood, that before having the license, they need to just to fill up a kind of CPD questionnaire, something, just to make sure that they know basically the rules and everything needed just to be, at the right level. Not right, Andrew? Yeah. So I think this is something we talked about last year already, and related to the Swedish system with the green card, that should be something that could be implemented in the FEI campus or something, because now we have the same thing for the officials. We should do the same thing for the riders. Before, would it be necessary before the first time to ask the international license? Another idea, maybe first, is to ask the riders who wish to ride at 4-star level or above for the first time. Well, that should be discussed, but it seems to be obvious that we need to make sure that the riders are aware what will happen anyway. Then, also for the education system, we talk about the necessity of having a long-term plan. And so, of course, the trainers and the coaches, they need to help the riders just to think on the long term, and probably you know that in February or March you have to make a plan, and you know what is your goal maybe in June or July, another goal in October, and then after you can build your calendar, your schedule related to the goal you fixed with your trainer and with your coach. Yes, we talk about as well about the coach guidelines, and this is something which will hopefully happen soon. We'll try to make a video on the FEI campus. And David had done already some nice videos, and we'll try to do it for the coaches, just for simple reminders, basics, and how we can really work, especially to help the new coming coaches or coaches from the new nations, just to help the riders. And then anything else?
I think we talked about maybe a system of having a few mentors in the sport who would take on some riders, but obviously those mentors have got to not have too many horses to ride and therefore not have enough time to do it. But we thought some mentors was a good way of education, about spreading it out somehow. Naturally, in this country, we've got quite a few riders to educate and not many riders to do the job. I mean, there's a few, but there's not that many.
Yeah, not enough, yeah.
But it could be something that we could look at.
Well, there's another point, because it was in this working group, we talk about the educations of the riders, but also about the riders rep. And this is the same thing, this is a topic we talked about last year, how really to raise and to push forward the riders rep.
Yeah, we thought the rider rep should become a little bit more formal. We really felt the rider rep should carry a little bit more weight, have a bit more of a presence. We even talked about, him sitting at the front of the riders briefing and being introduced as such, and being someone that everyone felt they could really relate to and interact with. Because at the moment, quite often the riders don't even know who the rider rep is. And we thought that was not necessarily meant to load on a poor rider who's having to ride, but we also felt that a rider rep shouldn't always be the same one. We know that officials' events have their favourites, and they like the ones that are fun to have and don't say much, but that's not really the point. We want someone that is maybe not doing it quite so often, so comes to the job a bit fresher, a bit more interested, and actually has more of a role, not less.
Yes, and then the process could be, because most of the time, or I mean quite often, the riders rep just realized that is the riders rep when we just watched the notice board. Yeah? And so obviously the organizer and the TD, they have the start lists. Then I think they could choose the riders rep a few days before the competition, give a call, and if the rider, just agreed, why not? And then it will be kind of part of the official team. And I think it should be at the first briefing on Wednesday. It should be on the other side of the table, just with the official, because it has an official role. And of course, the riders rep should be reachable at any time. His phone number should be on the notice board, and then it has to be at the last meeting before on Friday. That's something which is not very different than what happened now, but just to make sure that everybody is aware of who is the riders rep and how you can reach and talk to him if there's anything wrong.
Yeah, and I think it was mentioned even having a rider rep for the morning and a different one from the afternoon, so that people aren't obliged to being or hanging around with horses when they'd rather go home. So actually just to keep it much more flexible, but to have someone doing a slightly better job. That's enough.
I think it's enough. Any question?
not a question, but actually, there'd be no harm in the rider rep walking the course with the ground jury in the 2D.
Yeah.
I think that'd be a positive move.
That's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, good. Thank you, Mark.
Again, it's healthy. Exactly.
We discussed the position of the riders rep as well in our little working group, and it was recommended or asked for whether the riders rep could also be an active rider but not competing himself during that weekend. He must be attending throughout all the days. Maybe he has some pupil there or so. Is it necessarily the case that it has to be an active athlete on that event? Or could the rules be interpreted in that way as long as it's still an active rider, he hasn't to be one out of the field of competitors in that special event?
So you didn't talk about that, but it has been discussed. Yes. But as long as you have full access throughout the weekend, that they were there for the weekend. Right. Okay, I like that. Anything else? Great, thank you guys. I think that thank you very much. I think one of the messages that you hear all the way through with officials and also with this education process is really actually a better use of the campus. Now that the campus is up and running, and it is, it's formed, it's fully formed, people are using it, they're having to use it, they have to use it as an official. There's an education thing for lots of riders or people that are trying to find out about sports, not just about our sport. So maybe there's a way that we could use this for rider education and just put it onto the campus and maybe there's a requirement for the younger riders or first-timers, as we've heard a couple times throughout the process of slowing them down a little bit. So maybe there's a way to use that through one, possibly a rule side, two, maybe through some educational videos. Then national federations are going to have to kick in and become part of that process. So I think that's a direction that we could use. I do this little officials rules video and all that kind of stuff, and it really it's not that it's not that onerous, and we could easily put these little chapters and create a library of different people to be able to tap on to, let's say, William talk about cross country or Chris talking about cross country or somebody else talking about this. I mean, it would be, I think that could be a vehicle that we would use. Okay. Last but not least, we talk about future of the sport.
I'm pretty excited to be the guy that everybody has been waiting for, the last one. Before we get into this, I do just want to say, because it was brought up earlier, I put the kettlebell test of Dave Voss, wherever he is, on the NSO Facebook page, so all the NSOs can share it back to wherever they want. You'll have that there. So our group was, what should eventing look like in 10 years? And I think that was sort of part of the key of that, it was what should, not what will. So it's kind of a bit of the wish list, I guess. So the first thing that everybody talked about and was hard to get off of actually was the Olympics, obviously. And everybody felt that in 10 years it needs to be a huge piece to keep promoting the sport, and that it needs to be something that when you go to the Olympics, you leave a legacy for this host city from the venue. Not that you're destroying the city or leaving them something they can't use there. That gets turned into a golf course maybe, but something that they can actually be proud of. And that probably meant that, there was a feeling that that sport, at least for the Olympics, is going to have to evolve. And what that is, I don't think there was consensus amongst the group, but it's probably not necessarily going to be what it is today, and it certainly isn't what it was 10 years ago, but it's going to have to evolve. With that, the thought was that in 10 years you also have to have some version of the CCI at the rest of the competitions throughout the world. Obviously the World Championships, the Burleys, the Badmintons, the Kentuckys. And what those will be probably will change and morph a little bit as well, because we have to keep modernizing the sport. There was a big push that the sport as a whole, and we got into this a lot today with the flags, it needs to be simplified. It needs to be simplified. It needs to be a better, simple version of itself so that fans of the sport can understand what they're watching and don't have to have things explained to them just to know what's going on. Nobody wants to turn on TV and watch a sport that has to be explained repeatedly as to how the scoring goes. There was thought about the CCI. We had some talk about the CCI 5-star shorts, whether that's something with ERM or not, who knows, but that'll be another way to probably promote the sport. And at the same time, like I said, some version of keeping those CCI longs, whether they stay as the longs or championships, but that, again, the Burley, Badmintons, Adelaides, Kentuckys, Poes, Llewellyns, that those stay the destination events. Those are the championships, and they're the thing that everybody is aiming for. Again, in 10 years, who knows what that'll be, but we have to work to preserve that. And then a lot of thought about how to grow the base of the sport. I think the feeling is that the base of the sport, that's the fans. So the analogy I used was soccer or football in the United States when I was a kid was not a big professional sport to watch. But every kid, except for me because I'm really slow, but every kid played soccer when I was young. And now we're all getting older and we're fans. And I go to soccer games down in Orlando partially because Leslie Law makes me, but also because it's a much bigger sport. It's much more popular now because that base that was developed by U.S. soccer has become fans, and they grew the sport that way, and we need to find a way to do that. And that's going to mean going to untapped markets, going into Asia, India, Africa, places like that, and not pushing on them, here, you need to run this big marquee event, but saying, look, here's a sport that you guys can go out and do affordably at the lower levels and have some fun with and enjoy it, and start it that way and sort of build it organically. And having the FEI support that growth with education and solidarity programs like they've done in the past, but improve them, make them better. And then with growing of the sport, in 10 years, it's kind of foreseen there's going to be increased freedom for the individual riders and competitors to be able to promote themselves, promote their sponsors, and honestly, give up some of the tradition. I don't think in 10 years' time that we foresee ourselves wearing the same stuff that we're wearing now. Maybe you can go out there and you look a little bit like a football club with the team logo on your shirt. You can promote that stuff so that we can keep pushing more money into the sport and more ability to support those individual athletes and therefore the whole sport. And then the other thing that sort of came up at the end that I thought was pretty important is the FEI and the sport of eventing in general needs to be a leader and proactive in explaining how the sport benefits the horses. Take it away from what the racehorse guys said yesterday. I thought that was the first time I'd heard it explained to me that way, that it's not enough just to say my horse loves to jump, and if it didn't, I wouldn't be able to make a jump, but to say, because my horse jumps and because my horse events, it has a better quality of life, and all of the horses related to it and all of the horses in the world get a benefit out of it, and proactively explain what that is. And that's it. I did that pretty fast. You're welcome.
We're just talking about promoting the sport at the lower levels all the way through in other countries. I've actually drawn up a program, and there's a program in the FEI called the FEI Challenge, which is done for dressage and show jumping, where instead of the people traveling around for individual countries and places that are very hard to travel horses to, they actually send the same judges to the individual places, and it's the same type of course, it's the same dressage test. It's a very, very popular program over the last 30 years for developing the sport of dressage and sport of show jumping around the world. I've actually drawn up a thing this year and handed it over. We're just starting to have this conversation about doing the same thing for eventing, because all you really need is eventing on a polo pitch. And so to introduce eventing without having the full cross-country course, having 12 to 15 fences on a polo pitch that you can go and introduce to places so that they get the idea that jumping a solid fence is not as crazy as you think it is, and also doing dressage and show jumping, and then having the judges go around to the world. So we're just in the infancy of starting this, but we think it's a good place to go through to Asia, to Africa, to places, even the Caribbean, Central America, to be able to do this. And that's a program that we're actually starting, again, thinking about John's idea, is that if we can get a lot of these kids or amateurs involved into it, they're going to be fan bases, and then that's going to lead to one thing or another. So it's a program that we've actually started. I think that's it. There's kind of a summary thing, but really that is the summary. We just did it through your working groups. That is the summary for what happens a lot. I think we've heard a lot from each other. I can't thank you enough for participating, all 150 of you. It's pretty amazing to come here and get the ideas from the top. Would everybody want to? So in this last 4 years, we have changed. We have started a program. We started this, kind of a top sports summit. And then we went on, and during the other years, during the National Safety Officers meetings, some of them have been targeted to different things. We had course designers last year. And so this rotation throughout every year of having some ideas, and then every 4 years having this top type, or I wouldn't call it top summit, but just a summit about risk management in the sport in the future. Is this worth it to continue down this road and keep doing this? Yes? Every 4 years? You happy with that? I don't think it has to be any more for this level, right? The National Safety Officers is every year. I do believe that we should target different aspects of the sport every year, but every 4 years, we feel like this is the way to do it. Everybody's getting a benefit out of this in somehow, yes? Because that's what it has to be for. Okay, well, thank you. I think it's a good program as we go forward. There are some people to thank here, and this takes a tremendous amount of work to be able to put on with all the presentations, statistics, and things like that. So I really do want everybody to thank the ladies in the office for doing all of this work, and I want to introduce them. Fred. Yeah, Frederick. I want to introduce Rianne and Victoria. These are all names that you know because you get them all on emails. Stand up. You guys stand up so at least everybody knows that's Rianne and Victoria. Our professional statistician, I don't know how she does it. I have no idea, but Natalie, who does all the... So every form, every fence that you fill out, she puts into it, into the computer so that we can come out with information and data. So it's an enormous job. It's an enormous job to get away from this weekend. And then you also have to thank our leader, Katrin, for really running this whole group. So last of all, I want to thank you for your participation. I think it's very, very important for us to get together and hear this. This has been live streamed, so it's archived. All the presentations that were put on will be put on the website. So you can go back onto these presentations and go back and find something. The statistics will be on there. The presentations that are going to be here. It's archived for all of the work that, or all the talking that we've done. Please go ahead and use it. But when you go back to your national federations, encourage them to come see it. Encourage the people in your national federations in the eventing world to be able to come and look at these presentations themselves, and look at some of the lectures or presentations that have come on that are archived on the live stream. So I wanted to thank you. And then our last thing that we have. Do we have dinner? Yeah. Do we have a slide where that is? Yes. So is dinner. It is in this complex. In the, what's it called? Earl of Derby stand, which is just next building. Two down? Yeah, go that way, opposite the parade, which is just kind of almost around the corner. I think the bar is open. I'm fairly certain. So at least there's going to be that. Don't stampede, please. Don't stampede. So I think it's open now, and then dinner within the hour. Thank you very much, everybody. We really do appreciate it.